She planted herself at the boundary stone like she had grown there, arms folded, green eyes cutting through the gray harbor fog with the patience of someone who had no intention of going anywhere. Harlan Dawson was knee-deep in salt water behind the dry-docked hull of the Marin's Hope, a broad-beamed merchant cog that had taken a reef off the Corinth headland 3 weeks prior and was now his problem to fix, when his apprentice Jem came sprinting along the dock planking, nearly slipping twice, and grabbed the hull above his head. "There's a woman at your boundary post," Jem said, breathing hard. Harlan did not look up from the caulking iron in his hand. "Women have been known to exist, Jem." An orc woman. That made him look up. Harlan Dawson was 31 years old, built like someone had spent considerable time deciding where to put muscle and eventually given up being subtle about it. He had broad shoulders from years of hauling timber and dragging waterlogged hulls, hands that were more scar than skin, and a face that was honest without being remarkable, dark eyes, jaw rough with 3 days of not caring, hair the color of river-washed walnut. He was a shipwright by trade and by inheritance, the last of the Dawson Yard, and his land at the edge of Cawport Harbor was the one thing in the world that was unambiguously his. 40 yards of shoreside property, a repair shed, a cottage that needed work, and a boundary stone his grandfather had planted in the earth before Harlan had ever drawn breath. He handed the caulking iron to Jem and waded out of the shallows. She was standing at that stone. He saw her from 30 yards away and slowed his walk without realizing he was doing it. She was taller than most men in Cawport, though not by a freakish margin, and built in the way of orc women who had spent their lives working their bodies hard, all dense muscle and deliberate grace. Her skin was a deep olive green, smooth across her cheekbones and forearms, darker at the knuckles and down her jaw. Her hair was black, thick, and braided back in 2 tight plaits that fell over her shoulders. Her eyes, when she turned to look at him as he approached, were the color of new copper, a bright, warm amber green that did not match the cold competence in the rest of her face. She wore travel leathers, a fitted dark brown bodice, laced up the front and cut to follow the lines of her figure without any apology for doing so, over a form-fitting deep green shirt with sleeves rolled to the elbow. Her trousers were oiled leather, tucked into boots that had seen every kind of road. A short traveling cloak was pinned at one shoulder, and a dagger rode at her right hip, not decorative, just there, as natural as breathing. She had a pack on her back that looked heavy and did not seem to bother her at all. Harlan stopped at the boundary stone. They looked at each other. "You are the shipwright," she said. It was not a question. Her voice was lower than he expected, unhurried, with a faint Greywood clan accent that rounded certain vowels and made everything sound slightly considered. "I am," he said, "Harlan Dawson, and you're standing on my boundary." "I am standing at it," she said, with an emphasis that was precise and deliberate. "I have not yet crossed it." He looked at her feet. She was technically standing with both boots on the outside edge of the stone, not the inside. The distinction appeared to matter to her enormously. "Right," he said. "What can I do for you?" She looked at him steadily. "I was told you are traveling the Pilgrim Road north to the Corath Way House and then on toward the Aldenmere Shrines, that you have been hired to supervise the timber delivery for the Way House repairs and will not be back before midwinter. Who told you that?" "The harbor master. He talks very freely when offered a decent meal." Harlan dragged a hand through his damp hair. "Old Petter would absolutely do that. That's generally correct." "I leave in 2 days. I need to travel that road," she said. "I have business at the Aldenmere Shrines that will not wait. The Pilgrim Road runs through open country. You don't need my permission to use it." Her expression did not change, but something shifted in it, something careful and controlled. "I am an orc woman traveling alone on a road that runs through 6 human wayhouse districts. 2 of those districts are presently under the authority of Magistrate Valden, who does not extend the Pilgrim's protection to non-human travelers." She paused. "I would be arrested before I reached the 2nd wayhouse, possibly sooner." Harlan was quiet for a moment. He knew about Valden. Most people in Cawport did. The man had issued 3 separate writs in the past year excluding orc traders from the road markets, and there were ugly stories from the Northern Wayhouse about travelers who had not made it to their destinations. "You want to travel with me," he said. "Human escort on a pilgrim's warrant covers any traveling companion." "That is the law," she agreed. "And you're standing at my boundary because," he stopped, "worked it out. You won't come onto my land without permission." "A woman arrives at a man's land and asks him for something," she said evenly. "If she walks onto the land first, the asking becomes a demand. I do not make demands." The copper-green eyes held his without wavering. "I wait to be invited." Something about that hit him in a way he could not immediately articulate. He had met orc traders who pushed, orc laborers who kept their heads down, orc travelers who traveled at night to avoid attention. He had never met one who stood at a boundary stone with her chin level and her arms folded and simply refused to cross until the terms were negotiated correctly. "What's at the Aldenmere shrines?" he asked. "My business. I'll need more than that if I'm going to be listed on a pilgrim's warrant as your escort." She considered him for a moment, not evaluating whether to answer, he thought, but deciding exactly how much to say. "My grandmother is buried in the Aldenmere Grove. The shrines are watched over by the Tallow Brotherhood, and the Brotherhood will not allow orc mourners to approach without a human voucher. I wish to lay stones at her grave before the winter seals the pass. If I do not go now, the pass will be impassable until spring, and I have made a promise I intend to keep." The winter passes on the Korath Road closed reliably by the first deep cold. That was 6 weeks away at most. The Tallow Brotherhood's restrictions on non-human shrine visitors were well known and broadly considered shameful by anyone with a conscience, but they were also legally binding under the old compact, and there was nothing to be done about them except bring a vouching human. Harlan looked at her. She looked back at him. "My name is Ursa," she said. "Ursa Bonecrusher of the Greywood clan. My grandmother was Marta Bonecrusher, who died 3 winters past. I do not ask for charity. I will work for my passage. I can handle cargo, cook, set camp, and I have done this road before. You will not find me a burden." "I wasn't worried about that," Harlan said honestly. He stepped back from the stone. "Come onto my land, Ursa Bonecrusher. Let me show you where we keep the tea." Something crossed her face then, not surprise exactly, but something like it, quickly controlled. She stepped over the boundary stone with the gravity of someone crossing a threshold they have been waiting for, and fell into step beside him without another word. Her stride was longer than his, and she adjusted for it without being asked, which meant she was paying attention. Harlan noticed that too. The cottage was a single-story stone building behind the repair shed, with a narrow covered porch and a door that had been there since his grandfather's time and had never been replaced, which meant it hung at a slight angle and required a firm shove to open. He gave it that shove now and held it open. Ursa looked at the door with an expression that was not quite amusement but was in the same neighborhood. "I know," Harlan said. "It is not my place to comment," she said, and ducked slightly under the low lintel and went in. He made tea over the small iron stove while she sat at the workbench table and removed her pack, setting it on the floor with the careful deliberateness of someone who was always conscious of where their things were. The interior of the cottage was utilitarian and clean tools hung, charts rolled and stacked, a rack of drying rope cordage, a low cot behind a curtain, a writing desk covered in commission papers. It was the room of a man who lived in his work, which was true. "How long have you been a shipwright?" she asked. "Since I was 16. My father was one before me, his father before him." He set 2 cups on the table and poured. "The Dawson yard has been on this shoreline for 60 years. She wrapped both hands around the cup. She had big hands for a woman, long-fingered, strong, the kind of hands that were used to working. She looked at the cup rather than at him. "Do you have family here in Cawport?" "No," he said. "Not anymore." She looked up at that. There was no pity in her expression, which he appreciated more than he could have explained. "My mother died when I was 12, he said, because it was simply a fact and not a sore spot. "My father 3 years ago. The yard is mine. My apprentice Jem is 16 and lives with his own mother on the harbor street. And no wife, she said. Not a question. An observation. No wife, he agreed. She looked at the door hanging slightly open at its angle. A door like that, she said, is a difficult thing to knock on. It does not invite it. Harlan looked at the door. He had lived with it for 3 years and simply not dealt with it, the way you stop seeing things that were always there. I keep meaning to replace it. Said Ursa Bonecrusher and drank her tea. They left Copwort 2 mornings later in the thin gray light before the harbor woke up properly, with Harlan's loaded cart behind his broad-backed horse drover, and Ursa walking beside the cart with her pack shifted to the storage bed. He had gotten the Pilgrim's warrant from the road office. The clerk had stared at Ursa with unconcealed wariness, but had not said anything stupid, probably because Harlan was looking at him in a way that made it clear stupidity would be returned, and they had the papers in Harlan's coat pocket. The Pilgrim Road north out of Copwort was a real road for the first 10 miles, cobbled and maintained, lined on the western side by the low shrines that pilgrims had been stopping at for 300 years, little stone alcoves with offering niches, weather-worn carved faces, candle stumps and dried flowers and smooth stones left by the faithful. On the eastern side, the land dropped away toward the harbor inlet and then opened into the broad gray sea. Ursa walked at the cart's right side with her eyes moving across everything in a systematic way that Harlan recognized as someone who was always tracking exits and threats. He watched her do it without making it obvious he was watching. "You have done this road before," he said. "Twice," she said. "Both times with enough of my clan that Valden's road wardens left us alone. This is the first time I have needed a voucher. Where is your clan now?" She was quiet for a moment. The road rolled gently upward and the harbor dropped behind them, farther north. "The Greywood clan keeps to the Greywood. We do not have territory disputes with the border lords up there, and the lumber and hide trade is steady. My grandmother was the last of us who lived south of the Greywood boundary, so there is no one left to send. She lived near the Aldenmere shrines. She chose to die there," Ursa said. "She had a human man she loved for 40 years. He was buried in the Aldenmere Grove. She wanted to be near him." She said it without ceremony, the way she said most things. I liked her very much. Harlan thought about that. What happened to the man? He died of a winter fever when my grandmother was 62. She lived another 11 years after him, stubborn as stone. She glanced at Harlan briefly, and there was something almost fond in the look, maybe fond of the memory. She said the worst thing about outliving a good man was that you had to keep living in a world he had made better for you, without him in it. Harlan had nothing to add to that. He let it sit in the air between them, which felt like the right thing to do. They made 12 miles before midday and stopped at the first weighhouse, a low stone building with a covered yard where the Pilgrim Road travelers traditionally rested their animals and ate. The weighhouse keeper was a thick-armed woman named Bet Varro who had run the place for 20 years and had, apparently, decided that the world could go hang if it didn't like who she served. She put a bowl of stew in front of Ursa without a flicker of hesitation and poured Harlan's ale without asking whether he wanted it. "Where are you headed?" Bet asked, leaning on the counter. "Aldenmere," Harlan said, "before the pass closes." "That's the plan." Bet looked at Ursa. "You are a Greywood woman." "I am," Ursa said. "Your grandmother was Marta Bonecrusher. It was not a question." Ursa stilled. "You knew her." "She stopped here 3 times a year for the last decade of her life," Bet said. "Heading south to trade, heading back north. Always polite, always paid in full. The last time she came through she left me her recipe for salt-cured venison." Bet straightened up. "God's road to her grave, girl, you eat, and when you leave I'll put a travel loaf in your pack." Ursa looked at the counter for a moment. Her jaw moved slightly. "Thank you," she said quietly. Harlan looked at the side of Ursa's face and felt something turn over in his chest that he was not prepared to name yet. They were back on the road within the hour, Bet's travel loaf wrapped in cloth in the cart. The road began to climb as the afternoon wore on, the coastal plain giving way to the first of the hill country, brown grassland and scattered oak. The sky behind them went the color of old brass as the sun descended and the temperature dropped with meaning. Ursa, who had been quiet for a long stretch, said, "There are 2 men following us." Harlan did not look back. "Since the way house, since a mile before it, they waited to pick us back up when we left. Road wardens, no wardens' badges. Trail clothes, one of them has a crossbow on his back. Bandits," Harlan said. He kept his voice level. "The hill country above the second way house has been bad for 2 years. I knew that coming in. What did you plan to do about it?" "I packed accordingly." He tilted his head toward the cart. "Second crate from the back under the rope coil. There's a short sword." Ursa reached back without stopping walking, lifted the rope coil, opened the crate, and drew out the sword with the matter-of-fact efficiency of someone who had been finding weapons in carts her whole life. She held it briefly, testing the balance, and then slid it under the edge of the cart's sideboard within easy reach. She also drew her own dagger and held it in her right hand along her thigh, where it was visible to anyone behind them but not conspicuously brandished. "The sight of you may be enough," Harlan said. "It usually is," she said without any particular pride. "It was just an assessment of a fact. It was enough." The 2 following men peeled off at the next bend and did not reappear. Harlan watched the ridgeline behind them in the orange last light until he was certain and then let himself exhale. "You were not frightened," Ursa observed. "I was a little frightened." "You did not show it." "No point showing it," he said. "Either you deal with the problem or you don't. Being frightened out loud doesn't change the math." She looked at him sidelong, and this time the look lasted long enough that he was aware of it, aware of the warmth of it, though her expression was still composed. "The harbor master said you were a good man," she said. "He did not say you were a sensible one. I was prepared to revise both assessments on arrival. And now, I am withholding judgment," she said, but the corner of her mouth moved, just barely. He saw it. He counted that as a win and said nothing. They made the second way house at full dark, a larger establishment with a sleeping loft and a common fire. The keeper here was younger, a thin man with careful eyes who looked at Ursa, and then at Harlan's pilgrim's warrant and said nothing that could be called objectionable, though he said everything else slightly too fast in a way that meant he was uncomfortable. Harlan booked them 2 cots in the loft, paid in Copport copper, and they ate dried salt fish and bread in the warmth of the common fire while 4 other travelers, all human, kept their distance with varying degrees of subtlety. Ursa ate with complete disregard for the atmosphere. "Does it bother you?" Harlan asked quietly. "The staring." "It has never bothered me in the way people expect it to," she said. She set down her bread and thought about it with the seriousness she brought to everything. "When I was young, it made me angry. Now I find it mostly boring. What people fear in me is what they do not know about me, and I cannot make them learn. I can only be what I am and let them deal with it." She picked her bread back up. "It bothers you more than it bothers me." He had not realized his jaw had been tight. He unclenched it. "People should treat you with basic courtesy." "Yes," she agreed. "They should. But I have not arranged my happiness around whether they do." She looked at him directly, and again there was that quality of warmth underneath the composure, copper-green eyes catching the firelight. "You are kind, Harlan Dawson. I noticed it at your boundary stone. You were not suspicious of me. You were just interested." "You were interesting," he said honestly. "Careful," she said, and the corner of her mouth did the thing again. "You are close to giving me a compliment." "I'll survive it," he said. She laughed then, a short, genuine sound, caught slightly as though she had not intended to let it out, and Harlan Dawson felt it land in the center of his chest and stay there like an ember. They slept in the loft with 2 other travelers between their cots, and it was cold, and the wood in the fire below had burned down by midnight, and Harlan woke at some point in the deep dark to find Ursa sitting upright on her cot with her dagger in her hand, absolutely still, listening. He sat up too. There was a sound from the road outside. Hoofbeats. Multiple. They came and went without slowing at the way house, and after a long moment Ursa put the dagger down and lay back down on her cot. "Road wardens," she said quietly to the dark. Valdens, possibly. Their circuit runs this far south. She was quiet. Go back to sleep. I'm fine. You need sleep to drive a cart effectively. I will watch until dawn. I sleep lighter than you do. You don't have to, Harlan, she said, and there was something in the way she said his name, not commanding but settled, sure of itself, that made further argument feel unnecessary. Go back to sleep. I have this. He lay back down and stared at the low ceiling of the loft and listened to her breathe in the dark, steady and calm, and was asleep again before he could form another thought. The third day of the road was the best of the three. The hill country broke open into a wide upland valley where the grass was still green, and the Pilgrim Road here was flanked by the most impressive series of shrines on the whole route, great carved standing stones, each one dedicated to a different old god, draped with travelers' offerings. Strips of cloth, carved tokens, dried herbs, coils of thread. The valley was broad and golden in the autumn light, and there were no other travelers in either direction, and Drover was in a good mood, and Ursa walked beside the cart with her face tipped up slightly toward the pale sun and her arms loose at her sides, and Harlan watched her without shame because she was worth watching. She had been telling him about the Greywood clan, not with the careful rationing of information she had done at first, but with the ease of someone who had decided the listener could be trusted. She described the northern forest with a precision that meant she loved it, the way the light came through the old pines in the morning, the trade routes and the seasonal markets, the clan's complex web of alliances and obligations with the other northern orc clans. She described her grandmother's house, a stone and timber building on the edge of the clan territory, old enough that the roots of the surrounding trees had grown into the foundation walls. It sounds like a good place, Harlan said. It was, she said. I stayed there through 3 winters after my grandmother died. Then I had to come south on a trade errand for the clan and then another errand, and somehow the southern roads became more familiar than the northern ones. She was quiet for a moment. I do not know exactly where I live now. I have a room in a trade house in Velenport, and I have my grandmother's house in the Greywood, and I have the road between them. That sounds lonely, Harlan said. She looked at him. It is, she said simply, with no attempt to soften it or defend against it. But I have not yet found the thing that would make me stop moving. Harlan thought about his yard in Cawport, his boundary stone, the cottage with the broken door. He thought about the way he had spent 3 years rebuilding other people's ships and coming home to silence. He thought about how he had not realized he was lonely until a woman stood at his land boundary and refused to cross it, and had made that one small act of restraint feel like more courtesy than anyone had shown him in years. He did not say any of that. But she was looking at him still, and her expression was doing something complicated, and he had the feeling she was thinking something similar. Tell me about your ships, she said, so he told her. He told her about the Marin's Hope, the reef damage, the particular challenge of a double-plank hull that had taken on water asymmetrically. He told her about the first ship he had ever repaired on his own, at 18, a small fishing vessel whose keel had cracked in a storm, how his father had stood at the yard edge and watched without helping because he said there was only one way to learn. He told her about the largest commission he had ever taken, a deep-draft merchant vessel that had taken 8 months to rebuild, and how he had stood on the finished deck the morning before she was launched and felt something like what he imagined fathers felt. Ursa listened to all of it with complete attention, asking questions that were good questions, questions that showed she understood the structural logic of what he was describing even when she didn't know the vocabulary. She asked how a keel worked. She asked about the wood, what species, why, what made one better than another. She asked what sound a properly caulked hull made when you knocked on it. Like a drum, he said. A good tight sound. When it's wrong you can hear it hollow or wet. She nodded slowly. So you read the ship by listening to it. By listening, by looking, by the way the wood feels under your hand. He paused. You learn to know a ship the way you learn to know anything. You have to pay attention. She looked at him for a long moment. You are very good at paying attention, she said. He was not sure if that was about ships. He thought it might not be entirely. He held her gaze. "So are you." The afternoon found them at the edge of Valden's district, which was announced by a series of official road markers listing the magistrate's name and seal and the restrictions that applied within his authority. Among them, in clear carved letters, was the prohibition on orc travelers without human surety. Ursa read the marker without expression. Then she looked at Harlan. He pulled the pilgrim's warrant from his coat and held it up between two fingers. "We're covered, provided the warden agrees. If he doesn't, I will have words with him." "Harlan," she said, and there was something careful in her voice. "Do not put yourself in difficulty for me." "It's not difficulty," he said. "It's paperwork. I am very good at paperwork." She looked at him in a way that was equal parts exasperation and warmth. "You are infuriating," she said. "That also," he agreed. They encountered the road warden at the district checkpoint half a mile later. Two men on horseback in Valden's gray and red livery, crossbows slung, expressions professionally unfriendly. The lead warden, a blocky man with a red beard, looked at Ursa with narrow eyes and then at Harlan. "Pilgrim's warrant," Harlan said, holding out the papers. The warden examined them with the slowness of a man who was hoping to find a problem. He found none. The warrant was correctly issued, signed by the Copport Road office, and listed Ursa Bonecrusher as a traveling companion under Harlan Dawson's surety. "You vouch for this orc," the warden said. "I do," Harlan said. "She is traveling to the Aldenmere shrines on a family pilgrimage. The law is clear. The law is what the magistrate says it is in his district." "The compact says otherwise," Harlan said, evenly. "The pilgrim's warrant predates Magistrate Valden's appointment by about 300 years. If you're inclined to dispute it, I suggest you take it up with the Copport Road office in writing. We'll be on our way." He clicked to Drover and the cart moved forward. There was a long moment behind them, then no hoofbeats following. Ursa walked at his right side, her face forward, her expression composed. After 100 yards, she said, very quietly, "I said do not put yourself in difficulty." "That was not difficulty. That was a short conversation. You contradicted a magistrate's warden on an open road." "I contradicted him correctly," Harlan said. "There's a difference." She was quiet for another 10 steps. Then, "Thank you," he glanced at her. She was looking straight ahead, but something in her face was softer than it had been. "You don't have to thank me," he said. "You had every right to be on that road." "Yes," she said, "but you said so, out loud, with no hesitation." She paused. "That matters." He thought about the boundary stone, about the way she had stood at it with her arms folded and refused to cross, about how many times in how many places she must have had to calculate exactly how much space she was allowed to take up. The thought made him feel something that was close to anger on her behalf, and also something else, something that was closer to protectiveness than anger. He did not say any of that either. He was accumulating a collection of unsaid things about Ursa Bonecrusher, and he suspected the collection was going to keep growing. They reached the Korath Way House on the 4th day. The Korath Way House was the last substantial shelter before the mountain pass, a large stone complex built around a central courtyard that served travelers, pilgrims, and the occasional merchant train. It was also where Harlan's timber delivery was waiting for him. 3 wagon loads of fir planking for the Wayhouse's planned expansion, sourced from a Copport merchant and contracted to be supervising checked and signed off by a certified shipwright. Because the Wayhouse keeper, one Aldrich Morn, was expanding a dock facility on the small lake behind the Wayhouse and apparently trusted no one else's assessment of timber quality. The Korath Way House was also, as it turned out, the place where the world came apart at the seams. They arrived in late afternoon to find the courtyard in controlled chaos. 3 wagons of timber, yes, but also a crowd of travelers all trying to get out of the mountain pass ahead of a weather report that had come down from the summit that morning with a merchant caravan. The pass was closing. Early. The first serious winter storm of the season had come down from the north 2 weeks ahead of schedule, and the summit road was already taking snow, and by the following morning it would be impassable. Harlan looked at the pass road. He looked at the sky, which had gone the particular color of pewter that meant business. He looked at Ursa. She was looking at the pass with an expression that was very controlled and very quiet. "How far is the Aldenmere Grove from the summit?" he asked. 6 miles past the summit in the valley below. The grove itself is sheltered." She paused. "If we leave now and move fast, we could reach it before dark. The storm will hit before morning." "I know. We would be caught on the summit road in it." "Yes." She looked at him. Her expression had closed down into something flat and careful. "I know what I am asking." "You haven't asked anything," he said. "I am thinking it very loudly." Harlan looked at the pass again. He had done this road before, not in winter, but he knew how the mountain behaved. The valley below the summit had a pilgrim shelter, a stone building that had been there for 100 years, built specifically for travelers caught by the mountain's moods. If they could make the summit before the storm hit hard, they could get down to the shelter. He looked back at Ursa. "What did you promise your grandmother?" Something moved in her face. "That I would come before the pass closed, that I would put stones on her grave, that I would tell her about the road." She stopped. She always wanted to hear about the road. She had not traveled in her last years. "Right," Harlan said. He turned to Jem, who had been driving the cart and was currently staring at the sky with the expression of someone who was very young and not entirely sure about mountain winters. "Jem, you stay here. Sign off on the timber delivery with Aldrich Morn. I'll leave you the certification papers. When I get back, I'll handle the formal report." "You're going up the pass," Jem said. "We're going up the pass," Harlan said, and looked at Ursa. She was watching him, and for once her expression was not composed. There was something open in it, something unguarded, something that looked startled. "You do not have to come," she said. "I know the pass. I can." "You need the voucher to get into the grove," he said. "The Tallow Brotherhood doesn't care about weather. They'll still want the papers." He was already unhooking Drover from the cart and checking the saddle pack. "Besides, I told you I'd get you there." "You told me nothing of the sort." "I told you we were going to the Aldenmere shrines. That was an implicit contract." He looked up at her. "I don't break my contracts." Ursa Bonecrusher looked at him for a long moment, and Harlan Dawson had the experience of being seen very clearly by a person who did not give that out carelessly, and it was one of the more significant moments of his life, though he could not have articulated why at the time. "Then let us go," she said. They went up. The pass road was narrow and steep, cut into the mountain's south face in long switchbacks. The stone was old and well laid, and the road markers were clear, which was good because the light faded fast once they were in the shadow of the summit ridge, and the sky ahead had gone the dark bluish-gray of incoming weather. The temperature dropped steadily with altitude. Harlan's breath clouded. Ursa's did too, and she walked with her cloak wrapped tighter and her pace unchanged, as though cold was an administrative matter rather than a physical one. The first snow came as they crossed the summit. It came horizontally, driven by a wind that materialized out of nowhere with genuine spite, and it was not a gentle introductory snow but a full winter declaration. Harlan grabbed Drover's bridle as the horse shied, and Ursa put her hand on the horse's neck and said something in a low voice that was either in the orc tongue or was just below the register of the wind, and the horse settled. "How far?" Harlan called over the wind. "The grove is 4 miles down." "The shelter is 2. Shelter first. The storm will pin us there for days." "I know." She turned to face him, snow in her plaited hair, and yelled, "You are not going to risk your life over 2 more miles, Harlan Dawson." "I'm not risking it, I'm calculating it. There's a difference." She grabbed the front of his coat. She was strong enough that it was not a gentle grab, it moved him half a step. Her face was 6 inches from his, copper-green eyes wide and fierce, and also, underneath the fierceness, worried. For him, she was worried for him. "The shelter," she said. "Then the grove, promise me." He looked at her. The snow was coming in sheets. He could feel the cold through his coat and down into his bones, and she was standing there with her hand in his coat and her face close and her expression doing something that he wanted to look at for much longer than the storm was going to permit. "Shelter," he said. "Then the grove." She let go of his coat. She turned and walked, and he followed, and Drover followed them both, and they went down the mountain road in the howling white. The shelter was exactly where the road markers said it would be. A low stone building built into the mountainside below a great overhanging rock, barely visible through the snow until they were nearly on top of it. The door was old iron-banded oak, and it was heavy, but it opened, and they brought Drover in too because there was a side stall clearly designed for exactly that purpose. And then Harlan pulled the door shut, and the noise of the storm went from a howl to a low roar, and the darkness inside the shelter was profound. He found a lantern on a hook by the door and a tinderbox beside it. He struck a light. The shelter was one stone room, a fireplace against the far wall, a stack of dry wood that the wayhouse system kept replenished, two rope-slung cots against one wall, a shelf with a tinned food supply, a water barrel. It was cold and smelled of stone and old smoke, and faintly, of everyone who had ever been stranded here before them. Ursa was already moving to the fireplace. She had the fire going with an efficiency that suggested she had done it many times in worse conditions, and the warmth began to push out immediately, flickering gold across the stone walls. Harlan saw to Drover feed from the pack, water from the barrel for the horse's bucket, a rub-down with the rough cloth from the saddle bag. The horse was unhappy but not harmed. When he turned back, Ursa was sitting by the fire, unbraiding one of her plaits with quick fingers, shaking out the melted snow. He sat down on the stone floor near the fire across from her and put his hands toward the warmth and did not speak for a while. The storm said everything that needed saying, roaring above the sheltering rock. Eventually Ursa said, "I am sorry. Don't be. You are stranded because of me." "I'm stranded because of a winter storm," he said. "Those have been happening without your assistance for considerably longer than either of us has been alive." She looked at the fire. "You could have stayed at the wayhouse. And you would have gone up alone." "Yes. Then I would have been warm and comfortable and worried for the rest of the winter. This is better." He paused. "How long do you think before it passes?" She tilted her head, listening to the storm in the way of someone who had grown up with mountain weather in their bones. "A day, maybe two. The Korath storms blow themselves out fast, but they are brutal while they last. A day or two." Harlan looked around the shelter. 2 cots, 1 fire, 1 lantern, 1 stack of wood, and the tinned food supply. He had eaten in worse circumstances. He looked back at Ursa and found her looking at him. She had finished rebraiding 1 plait and had not started on the second, and her black hair fell loose over that shoulder. And the firelight was doing something remarkable to the green of her skin, warming it gold, catching the amber in her eyes. She looked, in this moment, extremely beautiful and also very tired, the careful composure temporarily suspended by exhaustion and warmth, and the particular vulnerability of being caught in a storm with a person you were still deciding about. "When did you last eat?" he asked. "This morning." He went to the tin supply shelf and checked the inventory and found a tin of salt-preserved beans, a tin of something unlabeled that turned out to be pickled vegetables, and Bet Varro's travel loaf, still half intact in its cloth from 3 days ago. He sat back down by the fire and divided everything evenly, and they ate. "Tell me about the Greywood," he said. She looked at him. "I've told you more," he said. "You told me about the trade routes and the clan structure. Tell me what it looks like on a morning in early autumn." She was quiet for a moment, and he had the sense that this was a thing she did not usually hand to people, not the information, but the tenderness behind it. Then she said, "The light comes through the pines at a low angle for most of the morning, so everything is orange and gold, like the whole forest is on fire but slowly. The old trees are very large, the kind that have been there for hundreds of years. You can put both arms around them and not reach halfway. In the early morning there is always mist off the ground, and it moves between the trunks like something alive. When my grandmother was healthy, she used to walk out into it before breakfast and just stand there, and she would say the forest was breathing." Harlan watched her face as she said it. "You miss it," he said. "Every day," she said simply. "Then why haven't you gone back?" She looked at the fire for a long time. "Because the South has things I am trying to understand," she said, which seemed like it was not the whole answer, but he did not push it. They fed the fire through the evening and talked. They talked the way people talk when there is nothing else to do and nowhere else to be, wandering across topics without plan, following whatever thread presented itself. Harlan talked about ships and she asked good questions. She talked about trade negotiations with border lords, and he asked good questions. He told her about the worst repair he had ever attempted, on a condemned hull that everyone had agreed was beyond saving, which he had then saved out of stubbornness. And she laughed, a real laugh this time, full and unguarded, and the shelter felt suddenly much larger than it had. She told him about the time she had been in a trade dispute that had escalated into a formal trial by contest under Orc law, and she had won it, and the other party had refused to honor the result, and she had gone to find them about it. "What happened?" he asked. "They honored the result," she said, with a serenity that told him everything about what the finding them about it had involved. "I imagine they did," he said. "They were very persuasive at their second attempt." He laughed. She watched him laugh with an expression that was openly warm, openly pleased that she had made him do it, and she did not hide it, and he felt it like a hand pressed flat against his chest. The storm roared. At some point in the late night, Harlan stretched out on one cot and Ursa took the other, and the fire burned low between them, and the shelter was warm and dark except for the ember glow, and he lay on his back staring at the stone ceiling and knew he was not going to sleep for a while. He heard her shift on the cot across from him. "Are you awake?" he asked. "Yes." A long pause. The storm said something outside. Then Harlan said, "I am glad you came to my boundary stone." Another pause, longer. "I am glad you invited me in," she said. He fell asleep thinking about that, and her voice in the dark, and the ember light on the green of her skin. The storm lasted 36 hours. They did not run out of things to say for any meaningful stretch of those 36 hours, which told Harlan something about both of them. They slept in shifts, fed the fire, rationed the food correctly, and talked. He taught her the names of the knots he knew by feel in the dark with a coil of rope from Drover's pack, and she taught him 3 words in the Orc tongue. He asked what they meant, and she said they were the words for shelter, warmth, and direction, which were the 3 most important things in any language. He asked what the Orc word for alone was, and she told him, and the sound of it was very close to the word for silence, which she said was intentional. On the second afternoon, the storm eased. By early morning of the day after, the mountain was still and white, and the sky had gone the pale, clean blue of air washed by weather, and the pass road below them sparkled in the new light. They came down to the grove in the valley below. The Aldenmere Grove was a stand of ancient yew trees at the valley's edge, presided over by a small stone temple of the Tallow Brotherhood gray-robed monks, who maintained the pilgrim shrines on this side of the mountain, and kept the grove consecrated. There was a warden monk at the outer gate, an older man with a narrow face who looked at Ursa with the reflexive wariness of someone operating under instructions, and then looked at Harlan's pilgrim's warrant and human voucher with an expression of mild consternation. "The grove is consecrated ground," the monk said. "The warrant is in order," Harlan said. "I am vouching for her. She is here to mourn her grandmother who is buried in this grove. The Brotherhood's policy on non-human visitors is superseded by a valid pilgrim's warrant under the compact," Harlan said, with a patience that was starting to have edges. "I have been over this at 2 checkpoints already, and I am happy to continue having it for as long as you need, but she is going in." The monk looked at him for a moment with the particular expression of someone deciding whether an argument is worth the energy. He looked at Ursa, who was standing with her hands at her sides and her chin level and her expression entirely composed, not demanding, not angry, just present. He stepped aside. Ursa walked through the gate into the grove. Harlan followed her. The grove was quiet and old and beautiful, the yew trees enormous, their red berries bright against the snow, the light through the branches making patterns on the white ground. The graves here were simple stone markers, no effigies, just names and dates and sometimes a carved symbol. Ursa moved through them with purpose, reading the markers, turning left at the third row, and then she stopped. The marker read, Ursa Bonecrusher, loved by the man she loved. Return to the trees. Ursa stood in front of it for a long time. Harlan stood at a distance that felt correct, far enough to give her the privacy of it, close enough that she was not alone. Then she reached into her pack and took out 4 smooth river stones. She placed them one by one on the top of the marker, with a care and deliberateness that made the simple act enormous. She said something very quietly in the orc tongue, not loud enough for him to hear the words, and it sounded like a conversation rather than a prayer, like someone picking up a thread with a person they missed. When she was done, she stood up straight and turned around. Her eyes were bright, not crying but close. She met Harlan's gaze from across the grove and he walked toward her, and when he got there he did not say anything wise or comfort her with words. He just stood beside her and faced the marker with her, which seemed to be the right thing because she exhaled slowly and her shoulder came to rest against his arm and stayed there. They stood like that for a while. Then she said, very quietly, "She would have liked you." "I hope so," he said. She had very specific opinions about men. She looked at the marker. She would have said, "You have good hands." She always looked at people's hands first. What would she have said after that? Ursa turned her head and looked at him, and they were standing very close, his arm against her shoulder, and the grove was very quiet. She would have said that anyone who drove a cart up a mountain pass in a winter storm to be useful was worth keeping. She paused. She would have been right. Harlan looked back at her. "I'm worth keeping," he said. "Do not fish," she said. "That's a yes." She turned back to the marker and he saw the corner of her mouth move, the almost smile that he had now catalogued as one of his favorite things in the world. "It is possible," she said. He took her hand. It was a simple thing. He just reached out and took her hand where it hung at her side, and she looked down at their joined hands and then looked up at him with an expression that was entirely unguarded for perhaps the first time since the boundary stone, open and wondering and wanting, and he thought, there it is. There was the thing that had been building since she had stood at his land's edge and refused to cross it without permission. She turned toward him and said his name, just that, Harlan, in the low, unhurried voice that he had been hearing in his head for days, and he closed the remaining distance and kissed her. She kissed him back with the same deliberateness she brought to everything, not cautious, not hesitant, but considered and sure, both hands now on his face, the warmth of her palms against his jaw, and he had kissed women before and known it was pleasant, and this was something else. This was the kind of thing that rearranged the furniture of your interior life and left it better than before. They stood like that in the snow in the old grove, under the yew trees, while the graves of people who had loved each other watched in patient silence. When they broke apart, she looked at him. The copper green of her eyes was very warm. "I have been thinking about doing that since the second day," she said. "Since the second day," he repeated. "You handled the road wardens," she said. "It was very difficult to be dignified about it." He laughed and she leaned her forehead against his, and they stood there breathing each other's air in the cold, and it was, Harlan Dawson thought, the single best moment he had experienced in 31 years of living, and he did not try to contain it. They needed to come down the mountain before the pass filled again, which gave them purpose and forward motion, which was perhaps fortunate because Harlan suspected that left without purpose, he would have stood in that grove for considerably longer. They came down the mountain road as the day's light was still good, the horse moving carefully on the freshly packed snow, and every time the road narrowed and they walked close together, he was aware of her in the particular way you become aware of someone when you have just kissed them for the first time. Every angle, every proximity, every brush of her arm against his. She talked differently on the way down, not more but more openly. She told him things that were not strategic information, not logistical facts, but actual things. That she had been engaged once, at 22, To a clan warrior she had thought she understood, and had discovered over the following year that she had understood only the surface of him and the deeper parts were not worth knowing. That she had spent the years since then building a kind of self-sufficiency that she was proud of and also slightly lonely inside. That she had stopped in Copport because a trade contact had pointed her there, and she had found out about the Aldenmere Grove visit through the harbor master, and the whole thing had a quality of circumstance that she did not entirely trust. Because good things that come from circumstances seem like they might be taken away by circumstances, Harlan said. She looked at him sharply. Yes, exactly. I know the feeling, he said. My father died in the middle of a commission I couldn't put down. I was working for 3 days before I could stop to grieve, and afterward I thought, that's the shape of my life. Things come and go and the work stays. He paused. I stopped being surprised when things went. I stopped expecting them to stay. She was quiet. You've been at my boundary stone for 4 days, he said, in a manner of speaking. She looked at him and there was a wariness in it, yes, but also an ache, and underneath both of those a wanting that was unmistakable. I'm not going anywhere yet, she said carefully. Yet, he said. Yet, she said. He nodded. He did not push. He filed it carefully. They reached the Korath Wayhouse the following afternoon to find it in a state of organized chaos that was specifically about them. The chaos was centered in the courtyard, where a group of perhaps 15 people were gathered, travelers who had been stranded by the storm, Wayhouse staff, and standing in the courtyard center in gray and dread livery with the expression of a man who had been waiting to have someone important, 2 of Magistrate Valden's road wardens. These were not the checkpoint wardens from 3 days back. These were senior wardens' silver badges instead of iron, and a roll of official papers in the lead warden's hand. Aldrich Morn, the Wayhouse keeper, was standing at the courtyard edge with Jem behind him, and he looked profoundly uncomfortable. The lead warden stepped forward as Harlan brought Drover through the gate. Harlan Dawson, he said. That's me, Harlan said, stopping the horse. I am Senior Warden Croft on authority of Magistrate Valden. I am here to inform you that your pilgrim's warrant has been reviewed and found improperly issued. The Copport Road office is currently under review for irregularities. As of yesterday morning, pilgrim's warrants issued by that office are suspended pending investigation. He looked at Ursa. The orc woman is therefore traveling without valid human surety and is in violation of the district restrictions. Harlan stared at him. The compact is being interpreted by Magistrate Valden, whose authority in this district is valid. Croft's expression was professionally blank. The woman must return to the Copport boundary under warden escort. The courtyard was very quiet. Everyone was watching. Harlan looked at Ursa. She was looking at Croft with an expression of absolute stillness, the kind that was not calm but controlled, tightly controlled, and he knew, he could feel it, that she was calculating exactly how much of a response she could afford and what the cost of each version was. She caught him looking and gave a very small shake of her head. Do not make it worse. He looked back at Croft. The warrant was validly issued when we left Copport, Harlan said. It is no longer valid. Retroactive revocation of a pilgrim's warrant is not legal under the compact. The magistrate's lawyers disagree. Then the magistrate's lawyers are wrong. He heard his own voice level without the heat he was feeling and was vaguely surprised by it. My name is Harlan Dawson. I am a certified shipwright contracted to the Korath Wayhouse for timber inspection. I have a signed contract with Aldrich Morn, whose authority over this property predates and supersedes the magistrate's road ordinances within the Wayhouse compound. He looked at Morn. Morn straightened slightly. He was not a brave man, but he was a fair one, and Harlan could see him making the calculation. That is correct, Morn said, with a steadiness that suggested it cost him something. The Wayhouse is sovereign property under the old road charter. Warden authority ends at the courtyard gate. Croft looked at Morn. His expression did not change. The magistrate will note your position. I expect he will, Morn said. Ursa Bonecrusher is a guest of the Korath Wayhouse. She will be treated as such. There was a beat of silence. The gathered travelers watched. Jim, at the back of the crowd, had both fists pressed against his thighs in a nervous gesture Harlan recognized. Croft looked at Harlan. He looked at Ursa. He looked with the calculating attention of someone measuring future options at the crowd. He rolled his warrant papers and tucked them under his arm. "We will be informing the magistrate of the situation," he said. "Good day." He and his fellow warden turned and walked through the courtyard gate. The crowd exhaled collectively. Someone near the back made a sound that was not quite a cheer but had ambitions in that direction. Ursa looked at Harlan. He looked at Ursa. "I told you the Wayhouse contract would be useful," he said. She crossed the distance between them in 2 strides and took his face in both hands and kissed him hard. Right there in the courtyard in front of Aldrich Morn and Jem and 15 stranded travelers and all of their opinions. And it was not a gentle kiss but a decisive one. The kind of kiss that was also a statement, that was also a claim. And Harlan kissed her back with the same conviction, and heard someone behind him actually cheer this time, which Jem would later confirm had been himself. When she pulled back, her copper-green eyes were very bright and her expression was one he had not seen before on her face, completely unguarded, open, even fierce with something that was joy or something in Joy's family. "You," she said, "are very useful to have around." "I told you," he said. "I am revising my timeline," she said. "From yet to considerably longer than yet," she said. "To the kind of timeline that requires a permanent address." He felt something open in his chest that had been closed for a long time. "I have a yard in Cawport," he said carefully. "It has a decent boundary stone. The cottage needs work but the bones are good." A pause. "And the door is a disaster." "The door," she said, "is terrible. I should replace it." "Yes," she said, "you should." The corner of her mouth curved, full and real, the almost smile he had been cataloging all along breaking open into something complete. "Build me a door worth knocking on, Harlan Dawson." He looked at her. "And then what?" he asked. "And then I will knock," she said, "and you will answer, and we will see what kind of life a shipwright and a Greywood trader can build in a harbor town." He was quiet for a moment. "You're serious?" "I am always serious," she said. "Ask anyone. You would stay in Cawport." She looked at him steadily. "I told you I did not know where I lived. I have been moving between the Greywood and the South Roads for 4 years because I was looking for the thing that would make me stop. I did not know what it was until I stood at a boundary stone and refused to cross it, and a man came out with salt water still on his boots and invited me in for tea." She paused. "I know what it is now." "You're sure?" he said. "I was sure at the road warden's checkpoint," she said. "When you corrected them and told them I had every right to be on that road. I was sure of you then. The rest has been," she searched for the word, "arithmetic." Harlan Dawson stood in the Korath Wayhouse courtyard in the thin winter sun with an orc woman's hand still warm on his face, and understood that he was not going to be alone anymore, and the understanding was clean and large and simple, and he pressed his forehead to hers. "Then I'll build you a door," he said. The journey back to Cawport was 3 days as the journey out had been, but it had a different quality, the quality of return rather than departure, of things decided rather than uncertain. The road was familiar now in both directions, and the Wayhouses were familiar, and Jem drove the cart and pretended not to be watching Harlan and Ursa walking together, though Harlan caught him at it twice and did not bother to be subtle about it. They slept at the same Wayhouses. Bet Varro, at the first one, took one look at them walking in together and put her elbows on the counter and said, "Well then." Ursa looked at her with composure that was slightly undermined by warmth. "It appears so," she said. "Your grandmother," Bet said, "would have been insufferably pleased about this." "She would have taken personal credit for all of it," Ursa agreed. "She would have been right," Bet said. "Sit down, I'll heat the stew." They sat together at the end of the counter, close enough that their arms touched, and it was the easiest thing in the world. On the second night on the return road, in the Wayhouse loft with the fire burning properly this time and the storm far behind them in the mountains, Ursa shifted her cot closer to Harlan's and lay on her side looking at him and said quietly, "I want to ask you something." "Ask," he said. "When you are working," she said, "when you are rebuilding a ship, you said you have to pay attention to it. that you read it by listening and by the way the wood feels. That you have to learn it the way you learn anything. She paused. How long does it take to know a ship well enough to trust your work? He thought about it honestly. Depends on the ship, depends on the damage, sometimes a week, sometimes the whole commission. But you always know when you have it. Yes, you can feel it. There's a moment when the ship stops being a problem and starts being itself, and you understand it. She was quiet. Why are you asking? He said. Because I think that is the kind of person you are, she said. You do not rush. You pay attention until you know, and when you know, you commit. She looked at him steadily. I am that kind of person too. I know, he said. Then you know that when I say I am staying, I have paid enough attention to be sure of it. I know that too, he said. She reached across the small distance between their cots and her fingers found the inside of his wrist, a light touch, warm. He turned his hand and closed it around hers. They lay like that in the dark, hands joined across the gap, and the fire spoke to itself at the far end of the room. And outside the road was quiet and the sky was full of stars, and there was nothing between them but honesty and the willingness to keep going. By the time they descended the last hill before the Cawport flatlands and the harbor appeared below them, gray and silver in the morning light, Harlan had decided 3 things. First, that he was going to see an advocate about Magistrate Valden's retroactive warrant revocation, because that kind of administrative manipulation had to be challenged on the record, and he had both the contract and the testimony to do it. Second, that he was going to build the best door the Dawson cottage had ever had, which was admittedly a low bar, but which he intended to clear significantly. Third, that he was going to ask Ursa Bonecrusher to stay with enough directness that she could not mistake it for half measures. The harbor came up around them, the familiar smell of salt and rope and wood shavings and tar that was the smell of Harlan's whole life, and Ursa breathed it in and said, "It smells like work." "It does," he said. "I like it," she said. Jem stopped the cart at the yard gate. Harlan looked at the cottage and then looked at the door and felt the particular pointed awareness of a man looking at something he had been not seeing for years. "That door," he said. "That door," Ursa agreed. He looked at her. "Give me a week." "1 week," she said. "Then come to the boundary stone." Something moved in her expression, crossing from warmth into something deeper. "And if the door is worth it, knock," he said. "I'll answer." She looked at him for a long time. Then she leaned in and kissed him, brief and certain, and stepped back. "1 week," she said. "Do not disappoint me." She took her pack from the cart and walked away along the harbor street, and Harlan watched her go until she turned the corner, which took longer than he expected because her stride was long and unhurried and absolutely assured. And then he turned back to the cottage and looked at the door with the eye of a man who had been building and repairing things for 15 years, and had never once built anything for himself. He had work to do. He spent 2 days on the Valden problem first, because it mattered, and because it was the kind of thing that compounded if ignored. He went to the road advocate's office in the harbor market, laid out the facts: valid warrant at departure, retroactive suspension, senior warden's behavior at the Wayhouse, Mourn's testimony, and the advocate, a small and precise woman named Gillis Shurst, looked at the papers for a while and then looked at Harlan and said, "He's done this before. There are 3 other complaints on file. With yours I have standing for a formal challenge to the district court." "Do it," Harlan said. "It will take months." "I'm not going anywhere," he said. "Neither is she." Gillis Shurst made a note. "And the woman, Ursa Bonecrusher, she'll add her own testimony." "Good." Gilla looked at her papers. "Magistrate Valden has been building this district apparatus for 6 years. It is not going to fall over 1 complaint, but a formal challenge on the record with multiple complainants in front of the district court that puts it into the legal structure where it can be fought properly." She paused. "And courts look harder at wardens who interfere with certified contractual workers. Your shipwright contract with the Wayhouse was useful thinking." "I have my moments," Harlan said. He spent the next 4 days on the door. He spent them properly, meaning He took the old door off its hinges on the first morning and stood it in the yard and looked at it for half an hour and noted every single thing wrong with it, which was almost everything, and then set it aside. He examined the frame. He measured it. He consulted the cottage's original construction in the foundation stones to understand what the wall could bear. He sourced his wood from the yard's good stock, a piece of dense river oak that he had been holding for a specific commission, and decided this was the specific commission, and a secondary piece of pale ash for the interior panel detail. He worked with the tools he had been using his entire professional life, the same planes and chisels and hammers that had been in the Dawson yard since his father's time, and he worked with a care he brought to the most demanding hull repairs. Jem watched from a respectful distance on the first day and then, unable to contain himself, came closer on the second. On the third day he said, "You're building it like a ship." "I'm building it like a door," Harlan said, without stopping what he was doing. "But I'm building it correctly." "Is it for her?" Jem asked. Harlan looked at him. "The whole harbor knows," Jem said, not defensively. "You walked up the mountain for her, in the winter storm. And you kissed her in the courtyard. You told the whole harbor." "I told my mother," she told the harbor. Jem paused. "My mother says she sounds remarkable. Your mother has never met her." "My mother says anyone you kiss in a courtyard in front of road wardens is remarkable by definition." Jem shifted his weight. "Is she staying?" "If the door is good enough," Harlan said. Jem looked at the door under construction, which was already, even unfinished, clearly the best-built door in this part of Copport. "I think she is staying," he said. Harlan finished the door on the 5th day, which was ahead of schedule. He hung it on the 6th day, adjusting the hinges twice and the latch once until the action was smooth and the door sat flush and level in its frame and swung with the kind of satisfying solidity that said, "This is a door that takes its role seriously." It was not decorative. It was not flashy. It was dense oak and honest joinery and a latch mechanism that worked correctly, and when you knocked on it, he tested this himself, it gave back a clear, resonant, full-throated sound, like a well-caulked hull. On the morning of the 7th day, he got up before the harbor woke and walked out to his boundary stone and stood beside it and waited. He did not wait long. She appeared at the harbor street's end in the early light, her pack on her back, her travel leathers the same one she had stood in at this same boundary stone 7 days ago, her black plates over her shoulders. She walked with the long, unhurried, absolutely assured stride that he had spent a week thinking about, and she came to the boundary stone and stopped. She looked at the cottage, at the new door. Even from this distance he could see something move through her expression. She walked up to it. She stood before it. She raised her hand and knocked, and the sound it gave back, clear and resonant and solid, carried across the quiet yard. He was already at the door when she knocked. He opened it. She was standing in the morning light with the harbor behind her, and her copper-green eyes were doing something complicated and warm and wholly unguarded, and she looked at him and looked at the door and looked at him again. "It is," she said, "an excellent door." "It is," he agreed. "Do you want to come in?" She put her hand on the door's edge, feeling the weight of it, the quality of the fit. She turned it once on its hinges, testing, and it swung smooth and true. She looked at him. "I want to stay in," she said. "If that is also on offer." He stepped back from the door. "It has always been on offer," he said. "I was just waiting for someone worth making the offer to." She crossed the threshold with the gravity of someone who knew the meaning of the act, and when she cleared the lintel she reached back and took his hand and pulled him gently with her, and the door swung shut behind them with the solid, unhurried sound of something finally fitting correctly, and the harbor went on being the harbor, and the boundary stone stood in the yard, and the morning came up gold over the water. They spent 3 days getting her settled, which involved moving the trade contact from Valenport to Copport, a process that was simpler than it might have been because Ursa had been conducting half her business via correspondence for years anyway, and the Copport harbor was objectively a better base than Valenport for the route she was running. The trade house in Valenport was a temporary arrangement she had been calling semi-permanent, and dismantling it required 2 letters and a conversation, not a great ordeal. She was efficient and practical about it, which was true to everything he knew about her, and she unpacked her things into the cottage with the same care and deliberateness she brought to every action, each object placed where she could find it. On the 4th evening they were both home before dark for the first time, and Harlan made a meal at the iron stove while she sat at the workbench with a ledger she was updating, and the fire was going and the new door was shut against the harbor wind, and the cottage felt different than it had in 3 years of silence, not louder, not busier, but fuller, like a room with all its windows finally open. He set a bowl in front of her. She looked up from the ledger, took in the bowl and then his face and said, "How do you feel about the north, the Greywood North?" "Eventually," she said. "I want to go back once the pass opens in spring. I have not been in 2 years. The clan will need to know," she paused, choosing her words, "what I have decided. That you've decided to live in Cawport. That I have found someone," she said, plainly, meeting his eyes with the directness he was beginning to understand was simply how she was with him now, all the strategy and guardedness reserved for people and situations that warranted it, and none of it for him. He sat down across from her. "I'd like to see the Greywood," he said. "If that's not if you want to bring me." "I am telling you about it because I want to bring you," she said. "Your clan," he said. "Will they? My clan will look at you very carefully for about 4 days," she said. "They will ask you difficult questions about ships and about your intentions and about what you know of orc customs. Some of them will be rude. Most of them will be curious. My cousin Barrow will challenge you to something physical, and you will lose because Barrow is built like a fortress and has been fighting since he was 12. And it will not matter that you lose because the point of the challenge is not to win it. The point is to accept it with dignity, which is something I believe you can manage. What happens after 4 days? After 4 days, you will have a meal at the clan fire and be formally acknowledged as my person." She said it simply as though it were logistics, but her eyes were warm. "That is the orc custom. It is not a ceremony, it is a meal. The acknowledgement is in who sits beside who and who is served from which bowl." "Your grandmother did this," he said, "with her human man." "Yes," she said. "He was a tanner. He went to the Greywood and survived 4 days, and afterward he sat at the clan fire and they acknowledged him, and he and my grandmother had 40 years. She looked at him steadily. "I told you she would have liked you." He thought about it. 4 days and a meal and being acknowledged as her person. In exchange for the Greywood, for the 40 years, for the kind of life her grandmother had described, in a world he had made better for you. "I can manage 4 days," he said. She smiled at him. Not the almost smile, not the controlled warmth, but fully, openly, with no reserve at all. And it was, as he had suspected it would be, the best thing he had ever seen. He reached across the workbench and touched her jaw, and she turned into his hand, and the evening settled around them like something finally at rest. The legal challenge against Magistrate Valden's warrant revocation moved slowly, as Gilla Shurst had warned it would, but it moved. 2 more complainants came forward by the 2nd month. A gnome merchant and a half-orc traveler who had both been turned back from Valden's district on similar retroactive pretexts. The case went to the district court with 4 complaints on the record, and the court appointed an independent reviewer, and Valden's lawyers became considerably less confident in tone. Gilla Shurst wrote Harlan a letter in the 3rd month saying she expected the road restrictions to be suspended pending the review, and that the warrant revocation practice would not survive formal scrutiny, and that Magistrate Valden had begun to have the expression of a man watching something he built be carefully disassembled. Ursa gave her own testimony in person at the district court, which was in a town 2 days' ride from Cawport. She gave it with the same composure and precision she brought to everything, and the court recorder had to ask her to slow down twice because she was giving more detail than they were prepared for, and the court's independent reviewer said afterward in Harlan's hearing that she had been one of the most useful witnesses he had encountered in 20 years of review work. On the road back from the court hearing, Ursa was quiet for most of the first hour and then said, "I have never done that before." Given testimony, "I have always assumed the system would." She stopped. "Work against you," he said. "Not bother," she said. "I have assumed it would not bother in either direction. That going through official channels would produce nothing worth the effort." She paused. "It is an uncomfortable feeling to discover you may have been wrong about something you organized your approach to the world around." He thought about that. "The system was working against you," he said carefully. "Valden built something specifically designed to exclude you. That was real. But challenging it formally, that's different from assuming the whole structure is hostile." "Gilla Schurst is very competent," Ursa said. "She is," he said, "and she wanted to fight it. She was waiting for someone to give her the standing." Ursa looked at the road ahead. "My grandmother's human man." "Did he fight this kind of thing?" "I don't know," Harlan said. "I didn't know him." "He was a tanner," Ursa said. "A quiet man, apparently, not a fighter, but my grandmother always said he had a way of staying present in situations where most people would step back. He did not shout, he did not argue, he just remained." She glanced at Harlan. "She said that was its own kind of courage." Harlan looked at the road. "I just argued with paperwork," he said. "It's not exactly heroic." "You argued with it at a Summit Pass checkpoint in a winter storm," she said. "And in a courtyard in front of road wardens who could have made things very bad for you, and in a district court for 3 hours." She paused. "I have had people I called allies who would not have done any of those 3 things." He reached across and took her hand on the saddle, the way he had started doing on any road they shared, and she turned her hand and held his back. "You are my person," she said, with the simplicity of a fact that had been true for longer than either of them had made it official. "I want you to know that I know that. Not because of the paperwork, because of the man." He pressed her hand. "Yes," he said. The winter was long and the harbor was busy, and the Dawson yard had 3 commissions running by the new year, which meant Jem was busier than he had ever been, and Harlan was in the water or under hulls for most of every day. Ursa set up a trade office at the edge of the yard, in a corner of the repair shed that they cleared and partitioned with timber offcuts, and ran her correspondence and ledger work from there, and occasionally consulted with Harlan about the structural qualities of different wood species, which he answered thoroughly. And she asked about his work, the way she had asked since the beginning, with genuine curiosity and good questions, and the attention of someone who understood that the person who built things was as interesting as the things they built. She learned to identify a hull timber by grain before he expected her to, and told him the name of a wood species he hadn't heard of, from the northern forests, that she said the Greywood clan used for tool handles because of its density and resistance to splitting. He had her bring him a sample and spend an afternoon with it, and told her the following morning that he thought it would also work for caulking hammers, and she went north by letter that week and arranged a sample delivery from the clan's spring timber cut. It was a collaboration, is what it was, and it had the quality of something that had been waiting to exist. In the evenings they ate together and talked and read, and in the cold nights she was warm beside him with a warmth that was not just physical but the warmth of presence, of someone who was present fully, not managing distance or maintaining reserve, and he could not have said what his life had felt like before except quieter in a way that was not peace but absence. She knocked on the door every time she came home, even though she lived there. He had asked her about it once, and she had looked at him with steady copper-green eyes and said, "Because I never want either of us to forget that I chose to be here. That every time I come through that door, it is a choice I am making freely." He had not asked again. He understood. The spring came with the smell of thaw off the mountains and the harbor filling with the seasonal trade ships, and Ursa began to talk about the Greywood with a frequency that was anticipation. They left for the north in the early spring, once the pass was confirmed open, with a proper-sized cart this time and 2 weeks' provisions. Jem managed the yard in Harlan's absence, with a confidence that had grown considerably over the winter, and Harlan's 3 open commissions were at stages that could hold for 2 weeks without his daily supervision. The Pilgrim Road was different in spring. Warmer, the shrines hung with early flowers, the wayhouses open and busy with returning pilgrims and traders, and the general human traffic that the road freeze had held back for months. Bet Varro at the first wayhouse served them both without comment except to say they looked well, by which she clearly meant something more specific, and she gave them a jar of preserved apples for the road. They crossed the summit pass in bright cold air, and stopped at the Aldenmere Grove on the way through, and Ursa added 5 new stones to her grandmother's marker, 1 for each month since the first visit, and stood with her hand in Harlan's, and said something quiet in the orc tongue that he did not need translated. The road north beyond the Aldenmere Valley was new to him, and it was beautiful. Hill country giving way to highland, the trees getting larger as they went, the pines becoming the great old pines she had described, orangelit in the morning, breathing mist in the low places. He drove the cart and she walked beside it and pointed out landmarks she knew from childhood. The rock formation that looked like an old man sleeping, the stream crossing where the current ran different in different seasons, the high meadow where the clan held the midsummer market. The Greywood itself was exactly as she had described it and also more, because described things always are, but also specifically more than that because it was hers. And seeing the way she stood differently inside it with the ease of someone returned to a place that was in their blood, made him love it for that reason. The Greywood clan was not what he had expected, which he had known intellectually was inevitable. He had known what she had told him, that they would look at him carefully and ask difficult questions, but the experience of it was different from the foreknowledge. The clan's encampment was a permanent settlement, not the nomadic war camp that his only mental model for orc clans would have suggested. A collection of sturdy timber and stone buildings in a clearing, an organized central fire, a tanning yard, a storage house, gardens at the settlement's edge. The people were a mix of ages, and in Harlan's experience, types: elderly craftspeople, working adults, young people who were by turns curious and performatively uninterested, and a sizable group of children who immediately circled the cart and began cataloging its contents with the thorough interest of people who had not been told there were rules about this. Ursa stood in the clearing center and was greeted by her people with a warmth that was genuine and specific, not ceremony. She was embraced by an elderly woman who he later learned was her father's sister, and clasped forearms with 2 men of her approximate age, and greeted by a young woman who appeared to be her cousin's daughter, and was very enthusiastic about the preserved apples from Bet Varro's wayhouse. Harlan stood beside the cart and let it happen, and did not feel excluded by it, which surprised him. He felt more accurately like a person watching something good that he was shortly going to be part of. Then Barrow arrived. Barrow was, as advertised, built like a fortress. He was approximately Harlan's age, slightly taller and wider in the shoulders by a margin that made the comparison feel unkind to everyone in the comparison's vicinity. He had the same Greywood clan coloring as Ursa: dark hair, olive green skin, and a face that was generally genial and currently evaluating. He looked at Harlan for a long moment. Harlan looked back. "She says you went up a mountain in a winter storm," Barrow said. "We went up a mountain in a winter storm," Harlan said. "And you argued with Valden's road wardens. Several times. Did you win?" "The court case is ongoing," Harlan said. "But yes, structurally." Barrow nodded slowly. He looked at Ursa across the clearing. She was not watching them, which meant she was absolutely watching them. "She has not brought anyone to the Greywood before," he said. "In my lifetime." "I know," Harlan said. "That means this is serious." "It is," Harlan said. "Then we will see how serious it is," Barrow said, and smiled, which was not reassuring in a face that size but was genuinely friendly, and Harlan decided to take it at face value. The challenge was an arm-wrestling contest at the clan fire that evening, which was simultaneously more civilized than he had feared, and more thoroughly humiliating than he had imagined possible. Because Barrow won in approximately 4 seconds and was so cheerfully unapologetic about it that there was nothing to do but laugh and accept the next cup of whatever was being passed around the fire. Which he did. He sat beside Ursa at the clan fire for 3 evenings, and asked questions of the people who asked him questions, and learned things about the northern timber and hide trade that were genuinely useful, and fixed a crack in one of the settlement's storage building doors on the 3rd day when he noticed it, simply because he noticed it and had the tools. And the elderly woman who was Ursa's father's sister watched him do it, and then looked at Ursa with an expression that Harlan could not quite read, but that seemed to be in the neighborhood of satisfaction. On the 4th evening there was a meal at the clan fire, and he was given a bowl, and Ursa sat beside him, and the elder woman said something in the Orc tongue that Ursa translated in a low voice as, "Acknowledged in your place, welcome to return." "Thank you," Harlan said, in the Orc tongue, which was one of the 3 words she had taught him, and the old woman's eyebrows went up slightly, and there was a murmur around the fire that was unmistakably approving. Ursa pressed her shoulder against his. "The word for welcome," she said quietly, "is also the word for direction." "The direction being toward the fire," he said. "The direction being home," she said and looked at him, and the firelight was in her copper-green eyes and her expression was the fully open smile, and he thought, yes, that is exactly it. They rode back south a week later, down the Pilgrim Road in the spring warmth, and stopped again at the Aldenmere Grove, and Ursa added one more stone to her grandmother's marker and stood with her face tipped up slightly toward the yew branches and then said, "She knows." "Knows what?" he said. "That I am not alone," Ursa said. "That I found the thing I was looking for. She knows." She looked at him with absolute certainty. She always did like being right. He kissed her in the grove under the yew trees, the way he had kissed her here the first time, with the snow gone now and the spring grass soft under their feet and the old stones watching in their patient way. She kissed him back the same way she always did, deliberate and sure and without reservation, and held his face in her hands, and somewhere in the branches a bird said something emphatic to the morning. They came home to Copwort on a clear day with the harbor full and the smell of salt and rope and sawdust coming up from the yard, and Drover moved faster with the smell of home in his nose, and Jem was on the dock with a sheaf of papers that needed Harlan's signature, and the repair shed was busy, and everything was exactly as it should be. Ursa went ahead to the cottage. Harlan dealt with Jem and the commission papers and the 3 questions that had been held for his return, and then walked across the yard to the cottage and found her standing at the door, not knocking, just standing, her hand on the door's frame looking at it. He came up beside her. She looked at him. "Every time," she said. "Every time," he said. She raised her hand and knocked. The door gave back its clear, resonant, full-bodied sound, the sound of a thing properly made, the sound of something solid enough to stand on. He opened it. She looked at him from the threshold with the copper-green eyes that had looked at him across a boundary stone and a mountain pass and a winter storm and a clan fire. Always the same eyes, always choosing him again. "Hello," she said. "Hello," he said. She came in, he followed. The door swung shut behind them, solid and true in the harbor morning, in the life they were building together, which was like every good ship, like every good door. A matter of paying attention, of working with the grain of things, of choosing the right materials and taking the time to fit them properly, so that what you made could bear weight. Out in the yard, the boundary stone stood in the earth where it had always stood, doing what boundary stones did, marking the place where one thing ended and another began, where outside became inside, where the open road became home, where a woman had once stood with her arms folded and refused to cross until she was invited, and a man had walked out of the salt water and said, "Come in." The harbor went on being the harbor. The work went on, and the door, when it was knocked on, always answered.